Welcome to Hints and Guesses, my podcast. Kent here. Thanks for tuning in. Really excited about today's conversation. I'm talking with Tony Jones. He's a friend. He's an author. He's a hunter. He's written more than 20 books. And he's got a new book out called The God of Wild Places, which is absolutely great, in my opinion. I really, really liked it. I encourage you to, listen to this conversation, see what you think, and I encourage you to buy it. You can buy it straight through his website, which is reverendhunter.com. I think that's right. And you'll find out. It's a personal conversation. It's a theological conversation, and I found it really inspiring. And in some ways, the kind of territory Tony Jones is exploring is what happens after certain religious or spiritual structures collapse, and what does a personal unraveling look like? Just one person's unraveling, and how did he find his way back to a kind of living spirituality? And his came through contact with the wild world, through hiking and hunting and fishing and being outside and dogs and in some ways I think he's bumping into a kind of antidote for our modern illness. So anyway, see what you think, and love to hear your feedback, especially my patrons. Again, thank you so much for supporting me and for supporting this podcast. You can always send me a message anytime. In fact, this Sunday, I'm going to have just an open conversation with my patrons, which will be a somewhat regular thing coming up. And so it's just a free link, Zoom link, and we'll sit around and talk about what did we hear and what's going on and what questions are coming up out of your own life and in conversation with the podcast. So really looking forward to that. I have 3 offerings I want to tell you about that are somewhat time sensitive. 3 programs or intensives I have coming up. One is in June in Michigan. These are all on my website, kentdobson.com. So June in Michigan, I have a short retreat. I'm going to be up there speaking at C3 again. And in between the 2 Sundays, I'm going to offer something in Big Rapids, Michigan, which is at a friend's place that I just absolutely love to do programs at. So if you're interested, would love to have you sign up, and the sooner the better, just so I can get a sense for numbers. And the second one is I have an Animas program in Colorado. That's coming up in July. That's all through Animas Valley Institute. So that's a Soulcraft intensive, 5-day intensive, beautiful spot, not too far from Telluride. And then I have another program, which I'm just putting together now. This is July 31st, my birthday, through August 3, I believe. Also in Colorado, I'm speaking out there at Michael Hidalgo's church, a friend of mine, Denver Community Church. And prior to that, I'm going to lead a Wilderness Within retreat. Would love to have you do that. I'm going to have a co-guide with me, a friend from Animas. So the 2 of us will be guiding together. And the sooner we have signups, for all of these programs, really, Animas is well on the way. They have their own what's the right word? Connections and people interested in their programs. But the other 2 that I'm doing, Wilderness Within programs, my own stuff, the sooner we have signups, the better. That way we'll know if they're a go and if we have the numbers. So if you're interested in coming out into wild places with me, love to have you. You don't need, this is not like backpacking. These are not, each program is a little bit different, but you don't have to have outdoor experience. It's not a bunch of REI shoppers, with their Yeti cups. You can, you can beg and borrow for outdoor gear. I can help you with that too. So, but being outside in wild places is good for the heart. It's good for the soul. It's good for our sense of aim and meaning and purpose and direction. And it's a good place to be honest. So, would love to see you out there, and that's all I have for the time being. Enjoy my conversation with Tony. Thanks, Tony, for coming on.
Ken, it's great to see you, man.
Yeah.
How's Georgia?
I think I'd need an hour with you off
Okay.
the air to answer that
Yeah.
question.
All
It's
right.
been actually really hard. Um,
Yeah.
I
Huh.
didn't realize that. I mean, Georgia was always calling our name because my wife's from here. We own land here.
Yeah.
There's like kind of like your situation there, about 200 acres of family land.
Mm.
And I bought into it. I bought a section of neighboring land like
Hmm.
15 years ago when I had money. And the hope was always to come down here and tend the land. And my daughter is big time into horses now, so we brought our horses down with us. And um, but then there's just getting settled in a new place and all these family dynamics
Yeah.
and Grand Rapids is as much as I feel kind of placeless. It's certainly a place where I had a lot of support.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
Generally, people were giving me the thumbs up. my
Yeah.
my friends, not
Yeah.
everyone, of course.
Yeah.
But
Right.
yeah, probably we don't need to take up more time with that. But
No, that's interesting. I'm actually going to be in your old stomping grounds the first weekend of May. I'll be in Grand Rapids speaking at C3
yeah,
and at what's the other one called? Open Circle?
Open Circle. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's Matt Laidlaw's gig. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm really glad.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that's happening.
Yeah. I think you got that going a while back, so I appreciate it. But yeah, I can see that. I mean, as you know from the book, I'm so anchored to Minnesota and to that land in central Minnesota. And it's funny because I think you and I have, we have some parallels in our journeys.
Mm.
And so people have asked me, "Are you still a Christian?" After reading this book. My mom read an earlier draft and she said, you're never going to be asked to preach ever again in a church. And I was like, why is that? And she said, well, because in the last chapter, you write God with a small g.
Mm.
I was like, oh
Yeah.
my gosh, if that's what gets me. But of course, I changed that in the final manuscript in some ways because you make these choices of like, is that really worth it? If
Yeah.
it's, but,
You know who else does
but
that? N.T. Wright, now that I think about it,
yeah,
which
well, and
is funny. And
of course,
he's
Rob
like,
does it,
yeah, well, yeah.
Rob, Rob doesn't tend to capitalize anything, but
He doesn't tend
but
to use grammar.
yeah, exactly. To the point of you moving and stuff, I people have asked me that, and my answer has kind of been, well, I'm less Christian than I used to be. I don't know that that means I'm not Christian, but what I mean by that is it was so much a part of my identity. I mean, that was my identity, was Christian, pastor, leader, Christian author. And now I think my identity is like Minnesotan, you know, outdoorsman. That Christian is down there on the list somewhere, but it used to be. I mean, that was the hallmark identifier of me, and that's one thing that's changed.
Yeah. Well, that makes me wonder, like, well, what are we talking about here? What is your book about? Is it about a loss of identity? I mean, is that one way of putting it? Did you lose your, see, when I hear you say that, I hear something like, well, your identity was kind of rooted in Christendom. I don't know how much
Mm,
that has to do with Christianity
yeah.
or with a relationship with God. That's more of a social identity. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's true. I do think it's hard to extricate those. I don't know that I don't know. I used to, like all of us in the emerging church movement, used to rail on Christianity and Christendom, and be
Mhm.
very like Hauerwasian about that whole thing.
Mhm.
But I guess I'm less. That just seemed a little. That to me seems a little too easy because I don't even necessarily know what that means anymore. Because I look around and I'm like Christendom, but we don't really. I don't know that our society is in any particular way Christian, you know.
Yeah.
Um, so it's more like my involvement. You might call it like, okay, maybe it was churchianity, as
Mm.
as the old uh, phrase goes. Maybe it's churchianity that I have left, but also I'm just, as you know about me, I trained as a theologian, and um, my previous book was about the doctrine of the atonement. Like
Mm.
that kind of stuff was really important to me, like arguing about doctrines and
Mm.
biblical texts and things like that. And I just am really uninterested in that stuff for the most part. I am actually flying to LA to debate a Christian vegan tomorrow who argues that Jesus was a vegan and the church has hidden that up for 2000 years.
I love this kind of stuff. I mean, that's the thing with Jesus. You just get to project whatever you want, you know? And
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
uh,
there's just not that much source material on him. So you take one, you take one little, well, you've seen this happen 1,000 times. And I know you're a guy who loves the text, and who cares about that. At least you used to. I'd be interested if you still do, but I just feel less anchored to some of that, the doctrinal stuff and the infallibility of that text or something like that.
yeah, well, again, I guess I'm just running your words through my own evolving rubric, but I guess I'd still say, yeah, I mean, what does that have to do with a relationship with the divine or God
Hmm.
or Christ or um, I still see that largely as a social identity.
Hmm.
The first half of your life here, and I'm not even against that. I think that's how we all start. And maybe um, this is something I wanted to ask you about anyway, because it's kind of like a subtext. I think churches are good at allowing people to have a kind of spiritual journey, and most pastors are pretty good at allowing the congregants to be on their own path, even to diverge from um,
Hmm.
whatever they want, whatever they happen to want the path to look like. But
Yeah.
the church is not very good at allowing pastors, ministers, insiders to actually have a spiritual life or a spiritual journey that evolves and changes. And I mean, I imagine you would agree with that, but maybe you want to say something a little about that.
I think you're right, for sure. I do think that most churches and pastors are pretty cool with like, hey, wherever you are on the journey, we want you to sit in our pews on Sunday. They do struggle with people saying, hey, my journey has pulled me out of institutional church. I won't be
Hmm.
tithing anymore. That
Yeah.
pastors tend to have a bit of a problem with that when people say that. Um, and yeah, I mean, the way I have been saying it to some people is the church is pretty great at taking care of hurting people. The church is pretty bad at taking care of hurting pastors.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
And you're
Hmm.
saying the same thing, but I know that because of course I was intimately involved in your book and your journey and have such great memories of you in Denver, like giving that talk for the first time. The putting all the pieces together and
Hmm.
putting it out there was so courageous to do that. And I sometimes tell your story of like, oh, I know a guy who said, uh, yeah, sometimes I don't even know what the word God means anymore, which of course seems like a terribly uncontroversial statement for anybody who's on any kind of a spiritual journey to just admit like sometimes I don't know what these words mean. Like I'm struggling with them and the traditional sense of the word doesn't really fit, you know, where I'm at today or whatever. And I tell people that and they're like, "Oh, yeah, I mean, that's me too." You know,
Hmm.
me too.
Yeah.
I'm like, "Oh yeah, they never let him preach again." Like
Yeah.
like
Yeah, that
that
was
was
it.
his literally his last Sunday in the pulpit.
Yeah.
They're like, "What?"
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think, for me it was different and you were intimately involved in it, but in 2015, um just as my last book was coming out, a bunch of stuff was posted on me online and a lot of Christian leaders were like, can't you're radioactive now, like we can't take the heat now. That can't I think is Christendom. I think
Mhm.
that is Christendom. When other Christian authors and speakers and big name pastors were like, you're radioactive, your one said to me, your brand is now bad for my brand, and I'm sorry to
Wow.
say it, but at least she was honest. Like that was
Yeah.
why she was cutting me off and writing on the internet, that like telling the world she was cutting me off.
Hmm.
But that's Christendom,
Hmm.
I think, or evidence of Christendom, I guess. So, um, Yeah, it's nice to untether yourself from that institution and be able to write like you did, like I have in this book, honestly about the journey. Because if I were a pastor, man, the book you read would have been a very different book because I would have had to guard my words, think
Yeah.
through every sentence.
Yeah. Maybe you could even say what kind of book this is. I mean, so yeah, that's kind of
Well,
an odd question, but what kind of
no,
book is it?
no, it's
Yeah.
it's a good question because it's like your book, but I was really struggling and um I had written a memoir, basically a straightforward memoir that I built in such a way that it kind of read, I built it in kind of a three-act play. I was telling a story that had like you set the scene, then you build the tension and you have the conflict and then you have the resolution. But ha, surprise, surprise. Memoirs by like middle-aged white guys who live in the suburbs, not a genre that publishers are really begging
Yeah.
for
Yeah,
right now.
exactly. Yeah.
So I engaged with a new literary agent, and he really Jonathan Merritt, whom you maybe know of, and
I've talked to him a couple times. Yeah.
yeah,
Great person.
yeah, and he said, Tony, go back and read some Barbara Brown Taylor and tell me, is that memoir or is that not memoir? And I was
Mm.
like, oh, okay, yeah, I think it's memoir. And then I read it and I thought, no, it's not really memoir.
Mm.
I mean, it's memoir-ish. It's it would probably be categorized, believe it or not, as like Christian self-help or something. But it's like your book. It's memoir-ish.
Yeah.
So you use a personal anecdotes in that book to take the reader on a journey and say, basically, when have you been bitten by a camel and how did it change your life? And that's then what I tried to do is then I went back and I rewrote the whole thing in these thematic chapters.
Mm.
So it's memoir-ish. It follows a general trajectory of my life from the day I was ordained in 1997 until I don't know when it ends. I mean, it kind of ends at my father's death. It goes on a
Mm.
little bit past that. So 1997 to 2017. It's not an autobiography by any means, but it's all around a theme. And I mean, part of that is that obviously the theme is that it was my life in the outdoors and hunting particularly, but hunting, fishing, canoeing, hiking, and those kind of things brought me back to life. Now, as a for instance, and like my daughter is never mentioned in the book
Mm.
because that's just not, she didn't share that kind of life with me. Um, so that I guess is the point. I guess that in that way it's to say it's thematic. It's not like, oh, Tony Jones wrote a memoir. It's not that. It's like it's a book about finding God in the wilderness, which is what I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's about walking into the wilderness in a way and
Hmm.
letting it work on you. That's the way it seemed to me. Like it took the time it took. And first of all, one other thing about by the way, I'm finding this very helpful. What kind of book is this? Because I've been working on some new material and I gave it to my wife to read. And I tried to even uh, ask, like, what has happened to me since walking out of the megachurch, like the last 7 years of my life? And I kind of organized it around dreams because dreams and dream work and also wild places have been the major trap door that sort of opened for me. But because there's not a theme, it reads like more like a journal. She's like, this is a journal. This is not a book,
Mm, mm, mm.
and so therefore it doesn't work. So I'm
Right.
asking questions like, what is the theme? Like, what are the themes? And I almost feel like now 90% of it has to go. And that was something I was wondering about in the background of the writing. Like, I'm assuming, given what you just said, that there was a lot more material here, like in
Yeah.
the
Oh
memoir-ish
my
stuff.
gosh. Yeah.
But but I think you did a great job of being very honest and also using a filter here and being gracious enough and hidden enough about things that should stay hidden. So is that true?
Yeah, I mean, you're an author, that's exactly what happened. It took me 10 years to write my shortest book. I mean, you've seen some of my other books.
Yeah.
This is a short book. People read it in one or two sittings, and yes, exactly. An earlier version of it I gave to my friend Lauren Winner, who's the brilliant genius memoirist herself, and asked her to read it. And her notes were, this is like how she said it to me too. Oh, poor Tony. Woe is me. Tony had such a hard divorce, and he lives in Edina, Minnesota, in a nice, rich suburb. Like, boo hoo, poor Tony.
Wow.
I was
That's
like, brutal, brutal. But when
yeah.
you hear feedback like that, and then you're going back to do your revisions, it was like, I couldn't not hear her voice.
Mm,
She was like, Tony, no one wants you to air your dirty laundry about your divorce.
mm,
No one wants to hear how mad you are at your ex-wife. Nobody cares.
mm.
Nobody cares who was right and who was wrong. So great, you wrote all that. Now cut it out because no one wants that.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
it was great. So it went from being kind of I mean, mine was never really a journally, but it wasn't thematic. It was like, I'm going to tell my story. I'm going to tell the rawest bits. I'm going to air the dirty laundry and, come what may, kind of like in my Enneagram 8 defiant stance. And
Yeah.
it took sensitive readers, frankly, it took women reading it. Lauren, Carla Barnhill. I remember I called Barbara Brown Taylor, and because I was rereading Learning to Walk in the Dark, which is thematic, right? It's a theme. It's about darkness. That is the theme of that book. And I called her up, and we're kind of friends or whatever. And she knew I was working on this book. And I said, oh, my agent told me to reread all your books and like
Mm,
fashion mine after yours. And I said, I notice you never say should. You don't say, and all my previous books, as you know, Kent, were like should. Here's how you should think about the atonement. Here's how
yeah.
you should plant a church. Here's how you should pray. Should,
Mm,
should, should. And she said, oh, Tony, should. That's really how men talk. Women don't really talk like that.
mm,
It's like, okay, another lesson learned. Like
mm.
I can take the reader on a journey, but I don't need to tell them how they should walk into the woods or should engage the woods. And then the final thing I'd say, and I think you and I are similar about this, is because of all my theological and philosophical training, I can't go through profound experiences like in the outdoors without later reflecting on them theologically and
Yeah.
philosophically.
No kidding. In fact, I think three things happen. It's like there's the actual experience, there's the interpretation of the experience or the remembering, which is virtually the same thing. And then there's the where does this fall? Like what
That's right.
kind of
That's right.
what landscape does this land in? And that's really, really hard to do. It's hard for me to do. And or I do it too quickly. It's hard for me to do well, or I just want to speed up the process and say, I'm going
Yeah.
to ram
Yeah.
it through. This is a numinous encounter. I know it, this kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, actually, I want to talk a little philosophy now. I'm not a theologian and philosopher, as you know, but uh, um, okay, here's something I started wondering about partway through the book. And this has to do with like meta frames. So I'm going to make some gross generalizations. There's the meta frame of the Western and Christian world, which goes something like this. Uh, Redemption is possible. And maybe something along the lines of creation or the human or the created order has some sort of twist in the linen here, and it can be redeemed. That redemption is possible. Okay. um, then there's the Eastern frame, which is much more like the Tao, that that our purpose is to align ourselves with just the way things are, with reality, with nature, with a capital N. And first of all, I don't know if that kind of separation is fair. You could respond to that if you want, but that's actually what I started wondering about partway through, because so much of I think the real power in the book, in terms of experience, your experience in the wilderness, in the wild, in wild places, hunting and fishing and canoeing, is in to a certain extent a realignment with nature, with a capital
Mhm.
N. And I'm
Mhm.
not trying to make a theological statement, but I'm saying coming back into harmony with the way things are, with the raw reality of the wild world as it is, which is very Tao-like. But
Mhm.
then there's the question of redemption, like, can we be redeemed? Is there something wrong with the order of things? And so just hearing me riff on this a little bit, like, what are you hearing in what I'm saying, and how might that relate to some of the
Mhm.
the sub themes of the book here?
I I take your second point and I think, yes, that's what I was trying to do, or at least that's what I was feeling. I was feeling like I'm more aligned with the real world. I'm no longer looking for an escape hatch to some other transcendent realm where some divinity lives, where a long time ago, I jettisoned this idea of like that God is up and out and we're going to escape to heaven and we're just sinful, you know, human trapped in these meat puppets who are trying to escape this dimension or whatever. But also those kind of ideas are real sticky. I mean, I make this kind of joke in the book about, you see a football player score a touchdown and like point to heaven, like God's up there. Thank the Lord for this touchdown. And it's like, well, what about the people in Australia? Where are they pointing? There's no up there. There's no
Yeah,
there's no up there. That but
yeah.
but those mental frameworks are so hard to shake, so hard to shake. And we, of course, walk into a church and there are people raising their hands with their faces to the sky again, as though God's up and out, up and out. And so I've really worked hard, and this is what nature has helped me do is, I talk about in the chapter about dogs and this species with whom we're so connected, um, looking down, like bringing my eyes. I'm just going to look down around me.
Hmm.
The question about redemption, I don't know if I even use that term in the book,
You
redeem or
don't.
redemption, because it's got so much theological baggage for me. I'm not saying it does for you, and you're using it, freely, but I don't know. To be redeemed, it's like to be redeemed from what? I more feel like I survived a very hairy ordeal, some real turmoil and trauma in my life that was relational. Other people survive car wrecks or falling off a mountain while they're hiking. Mine was not. Mine was an emotional kind of accident. And I have metaphors in the book. I talk about it like being hit by a wave in the surf or being run over by a tornado or something like that. But I don't feel like I needed to be redeemed from anything.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't feel like nature. This is, let me, I want to read you something
Yeah,
because,
please.
this is so fascinating, and I just think you will love it, and um, it might give us something to talk about. This is from a woman I don't even know that well, who went to Solomon's Porch, which I knew her 10
Yeah.
years ago at church, and she's about our age. She's late 40s or early 50s, not and like a a white kind of Christian woman, not really my core like target readership in my book proposal. They
Mhm.
ask you in the book proposal, like, who's your target market? I wouldn't have said like suburban white Christian women, but she was very kind. She got my phone number and texted me, "Hi, this is," and she says her name, and she writes this, Kent. For most of my Christian experience, it felt to me like most books were written to show how the author found the buried grain of real truth, and without them, we never would know the true meaning of whatever it is they were writing about. Like the funnel that gets more narrow, this, felt like the inverse of that, that rather than metaphorically writing about a tiny mineral found deep, deep in the mountain and what it means, you said it's right here, it's the whole mountain and everything on it.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, if my book is a success, if that's what she found, the inverse of that funnel that we were all taught as pastors and Christian authors of like, you know what I mean?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Oh, I just thought about, that Rilke line. I live my life in widening circles that move out across the world. It's the same kind of image. It's like expansive and it is like that. I agree with that. There is a kind of circling around the mountain that's getting bigger here that you're doing, especially with, even the themes of the chapters. They kind of have their little landscapes that we get to explore for a while, and then you move to another landscape. You have a chapter on place, which is one of my favorites. You have a chapter on dogs. You have a chapter on death. I don't remember them all off the top of my head, but it's like circling, it's like the circle's getting bigger. And I really appreciate that. And there's not like a hammering back down. Even the last chapter, which I don't want to give away, you return to almost the question of what have I been saying here?
Yeah.
Like,
And Kent, that this won't surprise you either, but that was like the editor was like, you
oh,
have
I'm
to,
sure.
the editor at the publishing house is like, you have to land the plane. And I did not want to land the plane. I'm
I
like,
actually have figured that's what happened, but I'm good for you for trying.
you're the
Yeah.
second one to say, I bet they, because I'm like, do they make Rob Bell land the plane? He never has to land the plane. And all I've done in previous books is land the freaking plane. That's been the
Yeah.
whole point. And
Yeah.
so I that was not a hill. That was not a fight I was going to win. So I'm like, I will reluctantly, and I will even tell the reader, I'm doing this reluctantly. I'm going to
Yeah.
make some like vaguely normative claims about the divine in the last chapter, you know?
Yeah. Well, it's helpful in a way because I think for most people who are alive, paying attention, um, I think the phrase, to come back to the beginning of our conversation, that we don't know what we mean by God anymore, is now becoming much more of a common
Hmm.
experience. It's
Hmm.
like, yeah, I agree. Like you said, me too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but that's not necessary. We don't then have to then say nothing. It's almost like noble to say, okay, well, we don't know what we mean by God anymore, and I'm going to try anyway, and I'm going to
Yeah.
fumble around in the dark for a while, and like the title of this podcast, hints and guesses, and
Yeah.
so I did appreciate that. Okay, I'm not going to let go of this earlier thread unless you really slam it shut. Okay, I'll come back to um, maybe I'll be more explicit. In the Tao, there's no such thing as sin,
Hmm.
and yet you have a section on sin. So it's maybe the simplest way of putting the tension that I see here. And actually, I found something very profound that I never thought about. Of course, I knew that to sin, the Greek word means to miss the mark, and so perfect for your entire love affair with hunting. And
Hmm.
so obviously, there's that single image, but then you go into some further detail around how it was used in the myths. Like, I didn't know that Achilles' heel was the sin, was the mark. So that makes the concept even far more expansive than sort of like just missing the mark of some moral
Hmm.
universe.
Hmm.
But maybe just speak to a little bit of sin and why you brought that into the book.
Oh boy. Again, I maybe somewhat reluctantly, but I just felt like that I'm like, here's this biblical word that we've heard so many times. How many sermons have you heard? Hamartia means missing the mark. And I've watched pastors on stage with like bows and arrows,
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right.
I love it.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Never fired one themselves, but yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so then they come up or they have the little Nerf one, or, they're like, this is what it means. And God wants you to hit the bullseye. And I just thought, um, first of all, this word hamartia goes way back, yes, to ancient mythology. Like the biblical writers were, particularly Paul is using hamartia, and I think, I. I think I was skeptical at first when N.T. Wright tried to convince us all that like Paul was very well versed in Hellenistic philosophy, but the more I think about it, and this hamartia is another example, I think, okay, I think probably Paul was like making literary allusions to his Gentile readers of stuff that was in their purview. That had he was bringing terminology that had heft to it. And what I say in that chapter is what Christians did was they take this idea of hamartia, which if you take, like Achilles' heel, his mom dips him in the river Styx, but she holds him by his heel. So that one part of him doesn't get dipped in the river Styx. And then that becomes, of course, that's the chink in the armor, literally on his body. That's like the one, if you can hit him there, you got him. And it was nothing, he didn't, there's no guilt. He has no guilt in that. It's
Right.
just like it's endemic to his existence that he has a weakness. And the point being, we all have this weakness. Like we all have a weakness, and it can be exploited by other human beings, and we're not guilty for it. But then of course Christianity comes along and adds this idea of you actually bear guilt for your hamartia, for your weakness, the ways you miss the mark. And I guess what I wanted to do was struggle with that in the page, this idea. And I've kind of shed this idea that we carry some kind of genetic guilt,
Yeah.
that we were born with. And obviously I rejected the doctrine of original sin a long time ago, before my last book, which but so, but it is this concept that is Christian sin, hamartia, but also extra Christian, beyond Christianity. I guess what I was trying to do is say there's a lot of resources we can bring to bear on this idea of who are we when we fail, when
Yeah.
we fall short of who we want to be. And obviously, what's the epigraph in that chapter, I think, is from Gary Snyder in his book, Practice of the Wild, which is a great book. If you haven't read it, Kent, you would
I
love it.
haven't. No, I've
The-
read a lot of his poems, but
yeah,
that.
the Practice of the Wild is like his treatise on being like basically a Buddhist outdoors person.
Mhm.
But he said, something about the wilderness. I don't have the whole quote off the top of my head, but it's like the wilderness can quickly bring one to extremity. And
Yeah.
that's this idea of like risk and failure that we've so insulated ourselves from in modern living, and that you have to now, I think, make a concerted effort to put yourself into wild places where you can be brought to extremity.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe it's a bit of an aside, but just to pull on the Gary Snyder thread, one of my favorite lines from him is he says, "To speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness."
Mm.
And in some ways, like you leaving the church and walking into wild places, even your own property, your own family property, um, you know, if he's right, it's like that's what you most needed is contact with wholeness. And
Mm.
wholeness is not the same thing as perfection, it's just it's a
Right.
rounding out. It
Yeah.
absorbs the flaws or the failures or death itself. It holds it in the same with the same loving embrace as it holds the will to live and life itself. And anyway, he says to speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness, and human beings came out of that wholeness. And that's like something else that you're.
You mean came out of it, like left it,
No, well, actually, I don't know. That's the
or
first
we're
time
like
I've
birthed in it,
birthed in it.
but now we
Yeah,
civilize it, man. We just cut it down and pave it,
I know. Yeah,
Yeah.
and in some ways, I thought in saying that he's giving us a kind of roadmap for how to touch wholeness again, which is we need wild places to do such a thing. I
Mhm,
mean, how can
mhm.
you? It's like a cut flower on a vase. It looks good for a little while, but we know what's going to happen. So I
Right,
mean,
right.
and I'm not even against civilization. I mean, perhaps that's also part of the mystery of our humanness. That's what we're going to do is make civilizations, period. But anyway, just back to this notion of feeling one's wholeness in the wholeness of the wild world. I mean, I think that's part of what started working on you over time. And
Yeah.
um, yeah, so I'm not sure that's
Well,
more just a
there's
comment, not a
another
question.
piece that I think, I mean, to touch on something we said earlier, the kind of, you have the experience, then you remember the experience, and then the writing about it. That's, to me, things become clear to me in the process of writing about the thing.
Me
And
too.
I have to write about the thing and look at it and be like, am I making that up? Like,
Hmm.
is that just a metaphor that seemed to fit and would be look good on the page, or is that really honest? And I've never had to write like that before because I've never done this kind of writing um, for publication. And so there was a lot of that, reading, rereading, cutting, and trying to be as honest as I know how to be. Um, and so one of the things that occurred to me in the midst of all this is, and I think it comes out in the book somewhat, is I really want to feel more connected to my ancestors,
Hmm.
to those people. Like, I am who I am and where I am because of a long chain of successful Homo sapiens,
Yeah,
who figured
five
out
million
how
years. No kidding.
not to die,
Mhm.
who figured out how to like cook meat so it would kill the parasites, who
Hmm.
figured out how to domesticate wolves so that this other species would guard the camp and they could sleep for 4 or 5 or 6 hours and their brains would grow in ways that the Neanderthal brains seem to not have been growing. Like,
Hmm.
we are Kent and Tony because of a long line of Homo sapiens who did a lot of things well and right. And I was so freaking self-centered, or I call it like chronocentrism, like that
Hmm.
we live at the most important time.
Hmm.
And I think I feel that less, and I feel more that I want to do things, even the practices of my life in the wild, that bring me more in touch with the people who got me here. And it's not really like ancestor worship or something like that. I just felt disconnected from those
Hmm.
people, and I don't want to feel disconnected. I want to express my gratitude to them by doing the things that they did. Like, all my predecessors killed animals. They
Hmm.
all killed animals to eat them. And we don't do that. That like came to a screeching halt 100 years ago. Um and I want to, if I'm going to eat animals, like, I want to kill the animals that I eat, and not, as I make the point in the book, to not use euphemisms about that. Like, oh, I
Hmm.
harvested a deer
Yeah,
this year. No, no, I
yeah.
I killed a deer,
Yeah,
and then I cut it open. I pulled its guts out, like, I butchered it. I packed it up, froze it, and ate it.
yeah,
Um
yeah. It's kind
so
of like
these Yeah.
oh, sorry. It's kind of like I went on a medicine journey. No, no, no. You took drugs. It's like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. It's like call saying, "Oh, we lost my uncle last year."
Yeah.
I'm like, "Oh, have you found him yet?" Like,
Yeah.
we die,
Yeah.
we die.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it. Let's call it what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Okay, I want to ask you something about killing here. Uh, um, I grew up hunting when I was young, and I stopped about high school. I shot one deer and couldn't find it, and I shot at one deer with my bow and missed because that's very hard to
Mm-hmm.
hit a deer with a bow. And
Hamartia.
I kind of found exactly. I kind of found like I sort of turned on it. If I can't find this deer that I know is somewhere, you look for like 2 days. I look for like 2 days.
Yeah.
And and I hit the deer. It wasn't like I mean, it was 5 feet in front of me. And I said, so I'm not gonna really hunt anymore. And now I'm ready to return to such a thing. Um and of course, as you know, I'm into mythology and stories and and have been into nature-based work and practices really strongly for the last 10 years. And I've read about something you bring forth in the book, that there's a relationship between predator and prey. And I know, and I can sense that sometimes. Like I have experience with that kind of on the sort of emotional, physical, imagination level, just wandering in wild places. Like being in really wild places, like standing in a stream with I had a grizzly bear and her cub come into a place where I was fishing in Alaska. I'm talking 10 feet away,
Wow.
and I could see that the bear wasn't going to kill me. I had a gun, but it was so close it wouldn't have mattered.
Yeah. Yeah.
Plus they can move like 10 feet before you could ever draw a gun. It's like
Absolutely. Yeah.
ridiculous. But I saw the way she looked at me and I thought, I'm not going to die today. Now, how did I know that? Like, but I
Hmm.
really did know that I'm not going to die today. And her cub is sitting there too, looking at me. Anyway, but actually I want to ask something more specific, which is something you mentioned in the book, that hunters will often say that something like the deer offered itself to me, or the
Hmm.
elk decided in a way to be a participatory member of this sacred relationship. I want to say, have you ever experienced something like that? Have you had that experience? Like, have you felt that kind of kinship while actually hunting? Or has it been sort of like almost there? Like, that's sort of what I'm asking.
That's a great question. I think it's been, to use your words, almost there. I don't know. I tell the story in the book of two different people I've had on my podcast, two very, very different people. One is a trans masculine. At the time was a trans masculine woman on my podcast, has now transitioned to identify as a trans man. And the other is like this 90-year-old Catholic priest
Mm.
who teaches at a seminary in St. Louis. Like, how different could these two people be? And they said almost verbatim the same thing. Like, I have passed on deer that have walked right in front of my deer blind because I've just known this deer was not giving herself or himself to me. And other times I've shot deer because I knew that's what they were doing. And I struggled with that when they told me that, because I'm like, how are you giving this animal agency? I don't see much in a, and this is, there's a lot of thought about this and question about this. And like I already told you, I'm flying to LA tomorrow to debate this vegan, and vegans often use this idea of sentience, like, oh, we would never kill a sentient being. But we're
Yeah, can't
like,
you go ahead?
yeah, like, how do you draw the, where do you, how do you, that is such an anthropocentric kind of characteristic. And then that we get to decide which animals are sentient and which are
Mhm.
not,
Yeah.
you know, life is death. Life is like this cycle of predator and prey. In 1 tablespoon of topsoil from like my garden out in my backyard, there are a million living organisms
Mm.
in that
Yeah.
topsoil.
Yeah.
And those are eating my plant's roots, and those become humus for the future plants. Like, this is the cycle. Um, and so I have not, and I tell another, story in the book of my friend Seth, who sits down with plants and asks them, "Can I harvest you?"
Yeah. I know people like that. Mhm.
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, in all honesty, no, I'm not there, but I'm much more, it's more of the other side of, I now make it a practice that I am thankful. I express my gratitude to the animal that I've killed for its life. And I guess I would even say for giving its life to me. Not that I'm at the point of granting that dear agency and that she made a choice to walk in front of my ladder stand so I could shoot her, but that um her life, I'm taking her life into me, into my own life and to my family. And so I'm thankful for that, and thankful for, in some sense, her allowing me to do that. Not that maybe she had a vote or whatever, but So I'm in a little bit of a gray area of not quite granting prey animals that kind of agency, but also wanting to get there.
Yeah. I suppose you can't, if it happens to you, it happens to you. I don't
Yeah.
think you can, it's not an intellectual exercise that you can talk yourself into.
No, but I think if I climbed into the ladder stand with that framing of like, let's see which deer gives him or herself to me
Mhm.
over the next 5 hours or something, yes, I guess I would probably be more likely to have that encounter and understand it in that way.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole mysterious thing. Like, um, our frames of reference, our rubrics create the world, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
So
yes, it's setting an intention to use
yeah,
kind of more spiritual language.
yeah,
Whether it's my wife Courtney like drawing tarot cards every day, not to tell the future, but to like set her intention for the day.
mm,
And so much of the spiritual life of prayer, meditation, contemplation is about that.
yeah. How do you feel about, well, I don't want this to be like a setup, so I'll just be more explicit, which is for a long time, I resonated with this spiritual but not religious vibe. And I
Mm,
don't know if we even talked about this last time you were in the podcast, but it's still circling for me. And actually, I feel something quite different that I'm actually really not all that spiritual, but I'm much more religious in my orientation.
mm.
And that's um well, what do you hear? What do you hear in spiritual but not religious? And does it matter to you where you fall on that scale, if there is such a thing? Um, yeah, how might you respond to that kind of cultural happening?
Yeah, I think these are shorthands, shorthand for what people are trying to articulate their experiences. They're obviously for a lot of people, they're trying to really say, I'm not part of organized religion. Using
Yeah.
the phrase nuns is another one that I think is helpful in giving a rubric for journalists and seminary professors and podcasters, but in real life, do some. I mean, that's kind of it's such an unless you're like an apophatic Peter Rollins, negative theologian, you probably don't want to call yourself a nothing, a nun. I'm none. I'm none. You know,
Yeah.
I see the phrase nothing in particular. I'm a nothing in particular is now kind of one that's bubbling up that people are saying. Um, because maybe none is a little too all or absolutist.
Yeah.
I uh, yeah, I mean I think my experience is that I'm so versed in Christian patterns of thought, all my theological training, I can never really like disabuse myself of all that I've learned.
Mm.
So I'll always probably my mind is just trained and like has these grooves in it. I think that I put things in certain categories or slots, and as much as I try through academic rigor and intellectual rigor, I should say, and also like the occasional psychedelic to
Mm.
break those grooves, and that does help me do it. But I'll always be the person I am and the person I was trained to be. So am I non-religious? No, I didn't leave religion like you. I think I am religious, quote unquote, because one of the things that religion taught me was the importance of, I guess, two things that religion taught me: being conscious, like being aware, you know, not just letting life slide you by, but paying attention to it.
Yeah.
And then also the importance of practices. And it would be very easy for me to kill a deer, got the deer, without stopping, laying my hand on that deer and spending some time with that deer just after it's died in thankfulness to it and to the universe for giving me that deer, to God or whatever you want to call it. Um, these are the practices, that I've tried to then incorporate into my outdoors life that I was that I learned. I mean, this goes back to Aristotle, right? That practices are how we shape our lives. And so I'm trying to be conscious, eyes open, awake to the world and to those experiences. And then I'm trying to incorporate practices into my life that are deliberate and help me shape that life. And I think that, I mean, those seem to me religious things, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's beautifully said. I've never quite thought about it that way. I tend to think about religious orientation. Well, first of all, I think about um, the religious instinct. That's an idea I got from Jung. So I don't think anyone gets away from this impulse toward meaning, if that's kind of a way of understanding
Yeah.
that religious instinct. But a religious orientation is like oriented toward life is sacred, and we can have a kind of sacred relationship with just the way things are, with reality, with a capital R. And it does require consciousness, attention, practices, self-examination, all the things that religions, plural, at least
Mhm.
have had some say in. Um, and yeah, I don't. Maybe we don't need to go on and on about that because we'll probably get away from the book a bit. But maybe short as I appreciate what you're saying about religion about religious orientation in the general sense. Um, okay, here was a big surprise. Tony Jones applied to be a pastor again after all this.
I know,
Okay,
Kent.
but wait. Just as a personal anecdote, I've done the same thing. You know, I
Yeah.
applied actually to be a pastor at a fairly well-known church in Grand Rapids that's more on the left. I'm actually really glad I didn't get the job like
Yeah.
now. But at the
Yeah.
time
Yeah.
I got rejected. I'm like, well, what do you mean? You know, like you know, another white guy with an advanced degree who can talk with people, you know, who can hold
I
the
know.
you're saying no. Anyway, that was actually a surprise to me. I didn't know that. I mean, maybe we just haven't talked about it in the few times that we've chatted over the last few years, but can you say something about that? And also, I
Mhm.
was glad you put it in the book. You could have bypassed it because it's not a huge part of the unfolding of the chapters here, but all of it struck me as a surprise near the end of the book. Can you say something about
It was the last thing I added to the book at the 11th
that?
hour because I wasn't going to tell that story because it t- I mean, your surprise and shock is why, because I thought people like would laugh, would be like, "Are you freaking kidding me? Why would you go running full speed into a brick wall again after having like your nose bloodied so many times?" And why? It was a few things. My friend, as I wrote in the book, my friend was there, and she and I have been very, very close friends for many, many years. And she wanted me to come. And I went and as an interim for 4 months and preached every other week. And I loved it. I loved the preaching. I love the preaching. I if you were to go back on YouTube and watch those sermons, you will notice I do not speak in the first person singular. I don't say I believe this about Jesus. I say things like the Christian church has always believed that Jesus fill in the blank. The Christian church has always understood Paul's message of grace and this way, which I can do. I can do that with full authenticity. I can talk about what the church believes. I'm not up there to tell everybody what Tony believes. I loved it. I was warmly received. Uh, the congregation loved me, loved my preaching. Um, and when they told me I wasn't getting, and then you've got to apply to be the new co-senior pastor. Like I was just doing this interim gig, and I was, every Sunday in the narthex. Oh my gosh, I really hope you're applying. I've been talking to people on the search committee, and they hope you're applying too. So I did foolishly. I didn't get the job. When the guy let me know that the chair of the search committee, he said, "Oh, you're by far the best preacher of everybody,
Yeah.
of all
Oh,
of our
thanks. That's
finalists.
supposed to help. Yeah.
You're by
Uh-huh.
far the best preacher."
Yeah.
And yes, Kent, back in the day, a guy who's got a PhD from Princeton and has written a bunch of books and is a great preacher, that would have just been a slam dunk for a big UCC church, the biggest UCC church in the country. That would have been a slam. They would have been like, "Oh my God, you're right out of central casting. Like this is exactly what we want." But that's not what they wanted. They didn't want, I think, I mean, they didn't tell me anything more, but I think they didn't want an Enneagram 8, probably. They wouldn't have said it like that. But Kent, I just think that people don't, when they look at me and the way that I am in the world, they don't see pastor. They have an idea, they have an archetype in their mind of a pastor who's like what, an Enneagram 5, or is very sweet and loving and big-hearted and empathetic. And that's not how I present to the world. Although, Courtney would say that is, there's a lot more of that in me than maybe I project. So it really hurt. My God, it hurt so much. Like for at least a year, every single day I thought about it. I thought about that rejection. Wow. I mean, Kent, this is crazy. I'm like, at the time I'm 54 years old and I can't get over another rejection. I like truly I haven't talked to my friend at that church since because I can't take the pain. I don't want her. She would say like, okay, let me tell you why you didn't get it. Let me give you the behind the scenes. I don't care. I don't want to know. I'm never, ever going to apply for another job again. I've made that commitment to Courtney and I will not violate it because I can't take the rejection anymore. Now, the other side of that coin, as I said to you at the very beginning of this conversation, is if I had gotten that job, this book wouldn't be what it was. I don't think this book would have been as good as it is.
Yeah.
Because I would have had those parishioners in mind as I wrote it, and I would have had that $130,000 a year salary, in mind as I wrote it. And I was unshackled from all that, and therefore I allowed myself to write much more honestly. So, back to Hamartia, maybe I dodged a bullet, as you probably did by not getting that job.
Yeah. I don't know. I disagree with you only in one respect, which is I think you can handle more rejection. I mean, in a way, that's what the whole book is about. I mean, what did you call it? You had this lovely trinity here of, I wrote it down at one point, panic, anguish, and terror.
My predators, yeah.
Yeah, your predators. Panic, anguish, terror, and we can add to the list rejection, misunderstanding, suspicion. And I mean, again, to speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness. When you're in relationship with something larger, when you're seeing more of the mountain, you can handle. I mean, I understand. I'm not trying to talk you into applying again.
No, I know what
you can make that commitment all day, but there might, but who knows, and actually you can handle more than you think. Otherwise you wouldn't have written this book. So,
that's true. That's probably true.
Yeah. Okay. I've got two other threads I just want to tug on briefly. Let me, okay. First of all, I was also wildly excited that you brought in Otto here, and I only know Otto through Jung, which is where Jung got his idea for the numinous. And I just want to bring that word in because I throw it around sometimes. It's been on my podcast. How did you come to what is the numinous? How'd you come to experience it? What would you say it's kind of like? It almost strikes me as a kind of compass inside your book here. And and just riff on that a bit.
Well, the thing I liked about Otto is that he took he was a Lutheran theologian who took a 2-year journey around the world, basically, and saw the way that other people in other parts of the world were experiencing God and were practicing their religions. And he came home. This is early 20th century, when that kind of round the world travel was very rigorous and a lot harder than it would be today, which is why it took him 2 years to do it. And when he got back home, he was what? He was definitely a pluralist, you know.
Mhm.
I wouldn't say he was a pantheist or something like that, but he was no longer he was still a okay, like maybe I am, and maybe like you are. I don't want to speak for you, but maybe like I am. He was still a quote unquote Christian theologian, but
Mhm.
he was so much more radically open to the to extra Christian encounters with the divine. And what I love that he did was he was again was like there's too much baggage on this word God. So I'm going to find a different word.
Mhm.
I'm going to basically come up with a neologism for it. We're going to call it the numinous. And it's one of those words you even hear if even if you don't know Latin, right?
Mhm.
You're like, "Oh yeah. Yeah, that's more like it."
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
more like what or somebody might say the ineffable or the
Mhm.
transcendent. These are all words actually that we played with for the subtitle.
Yeah.
And it ended up being rediscovering the divine because multiple people in publishing like no one knows what the numinous is. You can't, don't nobody knows what the ineffable is. Searching for the ineffable in the untamed outdoors
That's
is,
much better.
I mean, I
That's a
love
much
it.
better time. Yeah.
I love
But
it,
go
but
on, go on. Yeah.
but they're like, we also have to market your book.
It's also
So
bullshit too, because Abraham Heschel has a famous book of poems called the Ineffable Name of God,
mm,
Man. So if he can do it, I mean, I'm not saying you're Heschel. I'm not Heschel, but
I
just like
wish.
all this fear around, I get sick of it.
Kent, trust me, I didn't even want a subtitle. That was another
Yeah,
argument I
that would have
lost.
been great too. Yeah,
I agree. If there had been, it didn't need a subtitle, but they're like, "Oh no, you need a subtitle." So what are you going to do? You make the process of publishing is just like one compromise after another. But
totally.
I just I love Otto's idea of the numinous, and I really, really love this mysterium et tremendum, this that
Mhm.
you find God in the ineffable or in the mystery, and also in the tremendum, which is like in the terrifying. That God is this. There's this experience of God, and I do it in the outdoors. Otto didn't necessarily do it in the outdoors. I mean, he was also like, you can find this in Lutheran hymns, the
Mhm.
mysterium et tremendum. And but I have found in the outdoors, like, oh yeah, yeah, he's like, you're terrified of it, but drawn back to it. It's one of those things. It's like a volcano, You're like,
Yeah.
this could kill me, but also I really want to get closer to it. Like I want to feel the heat and see the lava, but also it could kill me. So that's it. Those kind of experiences are what he's talking about with the numinous, before him, a term used in the Romantic period that I write about is the sublime.
Yeah.
If it wouldn't have been a band name, it probably would have been you know it,
Yeah.
everything
They
carries
ruined it.
everything carries baggage. Probably I just should have come up with my own word for
Yeah.
God, but maybe next book.
Yeah, maybe so. No, I appreciate what you're saying here, and especially the terror side of things. And this is one of my big beefs with, progressive Christianity in the most general sense is, and maybe it's even just contemporary modern Christianity, not even progressive, but we strip the ineffable, the numinous of everything terrifying. And pretty soon God
Mhm.
is a friend and you
Yes.
can't do anything wrong. And it's just everything is great and we're going to manifest. And
I know.
it's just like, it's so flat. I mean, I think probably that kind of progressive friendly God is more why people are not religious than like the big scary God, that was like, trying to terrify people with hell. At least being afraid of hell is being alive. You're like, well, yeah, something is worth being frightened about. Not that I'm, a proponent of that, but I just mean like
Yeah.
trying to strip life and religion of
Yeah.
beauty and terror back to Rilke, just let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. No feeling is final. Just keep going. Like I think that
Yeah.
to me is like that's a bell that rings through the fog, on a night when your boat is lost, that kind of thing.
Well, I think you're right. And if there's one thing that like I want to hang on to from traditional religion or traditional Christianity is that like that's baked in the cake of our sacred text in Christianity, for instance, is this like, um, I think is this like Jesus is not your boyfriend.
Yeah.
Jesus is this like radical apocalyptic prophet who's proclaiming an eschaton, and it's talk about mysterium tremendum et fascinans. It's the eschaton that's approaching us. If you listen to what Jesus says, is terrifying and fascinating. It's like you can't look away from it, and yet you're worried that it's going to burn you up. This kind of thing.
Yeah, I love this. Okay. Um, one final piece here. Like I sent you a text that said my favorite chapter was
Mm.
place, and I think it still is, and it sort of sits somewhere in the middle of the book,
Hmm.
um, and I think going back and forth from Jerusalem as a tour guide all these years, and also living there, it's like just the question of place and of sacred place has
Hmm.
always like been tapping me on the shoulder. And you also mentioned Black Elk, which is another book I love, and one of the kind of asides in Black Elk is the Sacred Mountain. It's not an aside, but it's sort of like,
Hmm.
no, Harney Peak is the center of the universe,
Yeah.
and I remember hearing, probably actually first from Pete Rollins, just this idea that, okay, the burning bush is there to teach us that all places are sacred. And I kind of thought, oh yeah, that's profound. That's what it is. But also part of me now is uncomfortable with that, because it's almost like, well, then you don't have to go anywhere.
Yeah.
If there's no such thing as a sacred place, it's like the universe for me feels like, again, a kind of flat land of just resources. And
Yeah.
anyway, so I'm sort of dancing with something. I'm not even sure exactly what the
Yeah. Yeah.
question is, but what is a sacred place? And if we think about civilization as kind of unraveling a bit now, and for multiple reasons, and I'm not, for or against that right in this moment, but just like, what is our relationship with place, and what do wild places teach us? And do we need wild places and tame places? Do we need row pines and also like a mountain you're not and no one is allowed to go up? That's kind of
Hmm.
like my intuition. Yeah, put some row pines down and then say you can't go up there, and then also some wild places you can go to. I like the distinction between
Mm. Mm.
places, and I
Mm.
think that's part of the dance for me of around the question of sacred, and I don't know what the opposite would be, ordinary places. uh One quick like something funny in Grand Rapids, uh, like a church shut down, like they're doing in so many places, and somebody bought it, a developer bought it and turned it into apartments, and left certain parts of the church. Like you might have a stained glass in your, room, and
Okay.
the altar has like hot yoga pamphlets on it, this kind of thing, and it's just
Sure.
like,
Sure.
and part of me thinks like, okay, the rent goes up, but civilization in the deepest sense of that word goes down. Like there's a
Hmm.
there's a loss. There's like a
Yeah.
loss when with the god of economy that takes over. Anyway, I'm riffing a little bit, and I just
Yeah.
want you to
Yeah.
respond to a little bit about place.
Yeah. I uh I don't know if this jibes with the rest of my book actually, but I do say in there that I don't believe that any place on this planet is ontologically more sacred than any other place.
I think you
And
do say
which is
that at some or version of that. Yeah.
and which is why I get so frustrated at like why people are killing each other over Jerusalem. I want to tell these people like go find another sacred place that you don't have to fight someone else for.
Yeah.
Do your prayers there. Like that place, we've created that idea that Jerusalem is so sacred that it's worth fighting over. Thankfully, other than I think like Zionist evangelicals, Christians don't really believe that because they see that Jesus said, "This is a spiritual kingdom I'm talking about. This is not a physical place." And so there's something obviously to be said for like you do going back and walking in the footsteps. And I do that. I'm going to Rome next month, and I think it's my 22nd trip to Rome.
Yeah.
Um,
So you
it's a
feel it. You can reject the idea, but you feel it. You feel
Yeah, yeah, it's a very
the
special
pull.
place, but this is what I would say. It's a very special place to me. It's a very special place. This is a subjective determination. So it's a sacred place to me. Um and it of course that's in part because of the people who've gone before, but I would never try to convince I if somebody said to me, um, hey, I'm thinking about going to Rome. Should I go? I'd be like, oh my God, yeah, you should go. I'll give you my list of places to and I know the best tour guides and I know the best restaurants. And this is like a very, very special, sacred place to me. I feel the same way about Assisi, Italy, and I feel the same way about our family land in northern Minnesota. I used to feel it about the place, which I think I call it the trifecta of holiness or something in the book, the place at the front of the sanctuary where I was baptized, baptized, confirmed, and ordained, and then married, and then baptized my own kids on that. Funny, we didn't return to that same spot for the divorce. I mean, that probably would have been.
That would have been like more symbolic. That would have been
Yeah,
talk
yeah,
about. We need actually a kind of like liturgy of divorce.
yeah,
A kind of way of making that sacred as well. It seems to me. So
yeah.
anyway,
You think
let's not get
so?
sidetracked.
So I think we invest these places with meaning. One of my favorite stories from the Gospels is um the Transfiguration, where Peter says to Jesus mid Transfiguration, "Oh my gosh, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up 3 tabernacles. Like we need to like build a church here. We need to make something permanent. Like let's can we put up a plaque? Anything, like
Yeah.
Jesus was here or something." And Jesus just doesn't even respond, literally doesn't even respond to Peter, just starts walking down the mountain and like, nope, I've got shit to do, places to
Mhm.
go. Like I'm on the move. I'm not the kind of person who instantiates things permanently, like this is, this is movement. This isn't, um, construction. I'm not going to build a church and I'm not going to sit around and have so of course now there's a church there, but um I think that says so much about the movement of Jesus. And so I try not, I don't know, I'm going round and round, but there are places that are sacred to me, but I don't think I used to be told, I remember back in the early emergent days, and you probably heard this too, like, oh, you've got to go to like the Orkney Islands, or you've got to go walk, you've got to go walk the Camino. These are liminal places.
Mhm.
And uh,
They're also
I,
kind of like carnivals.
yeah, I think the
Yeah.
liminal is as liminal does or something. Like we make those places like that, or we can, it's the framing. Um,
I
but
don't know. I mean, there are also sacred wells and sacred caves and sacred
yeah,
springs, and that's that whole Irish Celtic domain, and not to mention that's what nature-based cultures all had. And so
yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, maybe not much more needs to be said about that. I think it's an important conversation.
Hmm.
What's sacred was, and maybe it ebbs and flows. Maybe there's a kind of evolution. Maybe places are sacred and they're not, and then they are, and I'm not fully satisfied with. Well, it's just subjective. It's sacred to me. Okay, well, yeah, but you also your book. You hope your kids will care for the land.
Yes,
So
true, true. No, you're
there's
right.
there's
I
a
don't think I'm totally convinced by it either.
yeah.
I'm that's one I struggle with, because there are places that are so sacred to me and important to me. Um, but I also am so, you and I have talked about this. I've never been to Israel. I don't really want to go. I don't understand why people are killing themselves over that place. I mean, I understand it intellectually, but in my heart and soul, I'm like, people, this is like so missing the point. But
Yeah.
then
Well,
again,
that's not all they're doing.
everybody I know who's been there, especially people who've been there with you, come back and they're like, dude, you're so wrong. There's something really, really special about that place. So
This is what we
I'll,
should do.
yeah.
I always wanted to do a trip. I always wanted to guide a trip that was just Jerusalem and Rome. That's it. You go to
Mm,
Jerusalem, you wander there for 4 days, you wonder what the heck happened here,
yeah.
and then you go to Rome and do the
Let's
same
do
thing.
it.
That we should do it
I'll,
together. We could
we should. You
co-create.
do Jerusalem, I'll do Rome. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
I love
Something
it.
new has just been born. All right.
I love it. I would do that in a heartbeat with you. That would be so fun.
Okay. We'll have to wait till the war's over.
Shoot.
In Israel. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
That damn war, messing up our plans
It's
to
put a real crimp in your
risk.
business model. I know.
Yeah, yeah, it
It
actually
sucks.
has. It's terrible. Terrible all the way around. So,
Yeah,
okay.
for sure.
I kind of want to land the plane here, even though feel we could talk for many hours. I just want
Yeah.
to thank you for writing this book. I think it is an excellent book, and it's for better or worse, you were freed up enough and went through enough panic, anguish, and terror to be able to, I don't know, craft something like this. I think it's a real gift. It also um, accidentally points towards some. I'm saying accidentally. It points toward a kind of modern illness that needs some attention, a kind of
Mm,
spiritual and moral and ethical and um, technological illness that we're all
mm,
suffering from, and the compass helped point in a certain direction toward the God of wild places. And I was very moved reading it
mm.
and encouraged. And so, yeah, thanks for. I think you could have not written this book and just moved on with your life. That was my sense.
Oh,
Maybe
interesting.
you would have had to write it, like in other words, to know what you thought about your own
Hmm.
life. But to
Hmm.
publish it, that's something different, Maybe you didn't have to do that, and I'm glad you
Mm.
did. So, yeah,
Well,
thanks.
thanks. I appreciate that. And, I've done some reflection. This book came out a week ago, and it's almost 9 years to the day from what happened in 2015, which you were intimately a part of. And, we both had some anguish over that. And it's been a long 9 years. But this just, there's, I had the book release party last week on Tuesday night, and a couple hundred people came, which was overwhelming. And Courtney said something after the next day. We were kind of processing it, like, what happened last night? It was like a book release party at a local brewery, but something magic happened.
Hmm.
And she said, I feel like I could exhale for the first time in 9 years. And I think there were a lot of people there who had been through what I went through in 2015 with me as friends and family, like you did, and we're like, oh my God, okay, all right. He survived it. We can celebrate. We couldn't celebrate then. In 2015, I had a book out, but there was no celebration. There was a lot of anguish. And now people like, so even you and me talking about it in a way that all that shit from 2015 is in the past, we can just talk about the new work. We can come up with new dreams of stuff we might do together and just rekindle our friendship, and not that stuff's be past. And I'm so thankful.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.